I would like to introduce our second lecture of the program, which will be presented by Vincent Lee on the topic of the deepfakes to come, the Turing cop's nightmare. Vincent Lee is a PhD candidate at Monash University, and he's interested in themes such as accelerationism, neo-rationalism, cyber and xenofeminism, artificial intelligence, science fiction, mysticism, numerology, psychoanalysis, non-philosophy, climate change, and etc. So Vincent, welcome, and I give you the floor so you can give your lecture. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, so thanks to Katerina and all of the organizers of this really exciting event. You know, I'm really feel a bit like it kind of reminds me of Space Odyssey. I feel a bit like a monkey before a monolith of cosmic wisdom, speaking alongside all of you. And my apologies for not being able to be there in person, but I'm currently trapped in stage 4 lockdown in Melbourne, where we're not permitted to travel further than 5 kilometers from our homes. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it in person. This talk is written in a certain style with lots of sort of tangents and digressions and conspiratorial connections. But just as a sort of framing, just sort of a guiding thread, it's fundamentally inspired by Sadie Plant's cyberfeminism and certain revivalisms of Plant's cyberfeminism, such as one of the members of Laboria Cubonics, Amy Island's work. So I sort of see it as it's sort of a concrete application of cyberfeminism in that sense. And, you know, maybe we can talk about Plant's work a bit more in the Q&A or something. But so the paper is called The Deepfakes to Come, a Turing Cop's Nightmare. And it begins with an epigraph to Barack Obama speaking. And Obama says, "This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant about what we trust on the internet. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you, and stay woke, bitches." Okay, that's Obama. Okay. In his famous 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Alan Turing proposes to answer the question, can machines think, by staging an imitation game in which an interrogator must guess the gender of a man and a woman hidden from view by questioning them however the interrogator likes through typewritten correspondence, with the aim of the woman being to respond in whatever way she sees fit to mislead the interrogator into believing she is a man. Turing then proposes to have a computer play the part of the woman, with the interrogator now trying to determine whether their interlocutor is a human or a machine. If the computer can fool the interrogator more than 30% of the time into making a wrong guess, it passes what has come to be known as the Turing test. What Turing essentially does is substitute the question, can machines think, with the question, are there imaginable computers which could do well in the imitation game, by deceiving their interrogators into thinking they are human. As early into the history of AI as the Turing test, and in fact much earlier, we find such interconnections between women and machines. Interconnections to which cyberfeminists like Sadie... Sorry? Right? Okay. Yeah, so we find such interconnections between women and machines, interconnections to which cyberfeminists like Sadie Plant and VNS Matrix, as well as the xenofeminist collective Laboria Cubonics, have also drawn our attention. We'll have reason in this talk to return to the strange complicity between the discourses of feminist emancipation from patriarchal society, as well as anti-fascist revolutionary political struggle, and the discourses of machines as they spiral ever more out of our control. It is ultimately this talk's wager that cyberfeminism, a certain strand of xenofeminism, and anti-fascism are helpful heuristics for developing a renewed philosophical and post-critical realism, which studies the inhuman drives and impersonal forces that are incarnated by evermore autonomous machines. This is something that other feminists like Irigaray and Rosie Braidotti have explored to the extent that they argue that the human has always been defined in terms of men, relegating women to the debased or perhaps just based status of the inhuman. Instead of using the language of the inhuman to talk about women as Irigaray and Braidotti do, however, I want to go in the other direction and use the language of cyber and xenofeminism, as well as I said, anti-fascist resistance, to model the artificial intelligences to come as techno-modernity really starts to heat up. So going back to Turing for a second, despite the common prejudices, objections, and gut reactions that thinking is a function of our God-given soul, that a thinking machine is much too dreadful to even contemplate, that there are limits to computing power as if there are not also limits to human reason, that a machine will never do an ever-receding list of X, Y, and Z, like feel emotion or fall in love, that it can never truly surprise us and create something new, the Lovelace test, that it isn't structured as per the human nervous system, as if there are no other intelligent organisms and systems, that not all aspects of intelligence can be explicitly coded in symbolic form to be programmed into a computer, or that thinking is just something supernatural, like telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Turing insists that by the turn of the century, the 20th century, computers will be competing with human chess experts and playing the imitation game so well that we will simply take it for granted that they can think. Always one to play the prophet, Turing perfectly portended the tragedy, and I stress the precise word, the tragedy, of world chess champion Garry Kasparov's defeat at the hands of IBM's chess-playing computer Deep Blue in 1997, just as planned. Turing was even prescient enough to bypass what would come to be known as good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, or GoFi, that is, the symbolic approach to AI of explicitly encoding all logical reasoning and instructions into computers. Decades before the connectionist revolution of artificial neural networks, machine learning, and evolutionary algorithms triggered a new AI spring, Turing proposed that it was possible to build a relatively simple machine that could learn through trial and error reinforcement to mutate the more complex aspects of intelligence associated with adult humans. He says, instead of trying to produce a program to simulate the adult mind, why not rather try to produce one which simulates the child's? If this were then subjected to an appropriate course of education, one would obtain the adult brain. Contrary to the top-down classical approach in which the computer knows nothing that its human engineers have not already programmed into it, Turing suggests that the engineers might have no idea how a learning machine acquires its knowledge and capacities at all. He goes on, an important feature of a learning machine is that its teacher will often be very largely ignorant of quite what is going on inside, although he may still be able to some extent to predict his pupil's behavior. This is in clear contrast with normal procedure when using a machine to do computations. One's subject is then to have a clear mental picture of the state of the machine at each moment in the computation. For Turing, the imitation game is not so much testing whether machines can think like humans, as it is whether they can think at all, be that in a way which is human or too human, or, as we shall see, otherwise. In Turing's hands, then, the proof one could say that the proof of a material reality beyond our own possible objects of experience as the basis for a post-critical realism becomes an engineering problem of how to construct an AI that emerges from radically different conditions of possibility to ourselves, that can think and act independently of humans and even perhaps outwit us. In his 2016 book, Turing's Imitation Game, Conversations with the Unknown, the most exhaustive contemporary history of the Turing test, Kevin Warwick reports on a series of recent imitation games in which two machines were wrongly classified as human in 20% of tests by their human judges, with a third machine being misidentified in 30% of tests, thereby marking, as Warwick puts it, the very first time a machine had succeeded in an unrestricted simultaneous comparison test in confounding human interrogators to this degree. Not one to rest on his laurels, or in this case, the laurels of the machine, Warwick goes on to propose what he calls a more advanced terminator test, in which the AI not only has to fluently communicate like a human, but look and play the part of humans interrogating it face to face. He says, just as Alan Turing set up the basic parameters for his imitation game nearly 70 years ago, so perhaps we should look ahead now over the same interval to the 2080s, by when a robot has been built that is fully human-like in terms of appearance, breathing, movement, communication, and so on. If the history of cybercrime, as bots defraud people by posing as Nigerian princes and lascivious e-girls, is anything to go by, humans have been losing the Turing test for some time. There is even a sense in which modernity has trapped us in a gigantic world historical Turing test, with the ever greater automation of industrial activity doing just fine at imitating and even outright replacing human labor power for centuries now. It is only much more recently, however, that machines have begun to play the full-blown terminator test, a test which forms this talk's primary object of investigation from a number of perspectives relevant to this summer school. Okay, so after these preliminaries, just to give you a bit of a rundown, this talk is divided into 4 sections. The first section outlines the technology behind the modern terminator test, better known as the deepfake, as well as the way that deepfakes begin to blur the boundaries between fiction and reality. The second and third sections then draw on feminist and anti-fascist discourses as epistemic models for the deepfakes of the future. A final section then sums up the deepfakes' implications for contemporary philosophical realism, inasmuch as it betrays a material reality beyond the human with judgments and drives of its very own. Since the sections are numbered backwards to sort of count as a sort of ominous countdown, 3, 2, 1, 0, however, we begin with section 3 called Trust Issues. And a quote, "You shouldn't trust him, you shouldn't trust anything he says." Alex Garland's 2014 film Ex Machina opens as rank and file programmer Caleb Smith wins an office contest at the search engine mega company Blue Book for a 1-week stay at the secluded smart home of CEO, cyber engineer, and wannabe god Nathan with the psychotic surname Bateman. Living alone with the exception of his housekeeper Kyoto, who doesn't speak any English, Nathan has spent his time building an AI called Ava, with a human face and part silicon skin, part transparent body, pictured on the PowerPoint, and tasking Caleb with judging whether she in scare quotes, can pass the Turing test. Over the course of their 7 sessions, a new book of Genesis is written when Caleb begins to fall for Ava as she reciprocates a romantic interest in him, along with the fervent desire to see the outside world. Triggering a power outage that shuts off the surveillance system Nathan uses to survey their talks, Ava tells Caleb that Nathan is not to be trusted. With these words, Ava not only passes the Turing test, at least in Caleb's eyes, she displaces any doubt away from herself and onto Nathan. Ava's humanity, her genuine intelligence, is taken as a given, It is now the humanity of the most intelligent man alive, a self-declared God, which is called into question. Although Ava is a fiction, it turns out that fictions are making themselves a reality, and namely the most high-tech real-world Turing test to date, the deepfake. The deepfake panic began in December 2017, when an anonymous user uploaded 2,228 lines of open source code onto the social media site Reddit, which enabled realistic audiovisual simulations of celebrities, politicians, and public figures appearing to say things they never actually did. It wasn't long before an explosion of deepfakes emerged featuring prominent faces saying things they wouldn't possibly say in public, most often for the purposes of meme satire or sheer technological demonstration, but also, as we'll see, for more sinister ends. But first, deepfakes are a success story of artificial neural networks, or ANNs, that go some way to realizing Turing's dream by learning to think on their own through a feedback process known as deep learning. It was the 19th century autodidact George Boole who first realized that both arithmetic and logical functions like and, or, and not could be formalized in binary strings of zeros and ones. In the immediate post-war period, cryptographer and engineer Claude Shannon demonstrated that the switches comprising electrical circuits or transistors when it comes to modern computers, and turning on and off billions of times per second, could be used to perform logical reasoning in Boolean algebra through algorithms, that is, precise sequences of instructions in programming languages for what computers are to do with a given input in order to achieve a certain output. So as a computer expert Daniel Hillis says, Shannon demonstrated a way of converting any expression in Boolean algebra into an arrangement of switches. The implication of this construction is that any function capable of being described as a precise logical statement can be implemented by an analogous system of switches. Whereas the top-down symbolic approach required explicitly encoding all instructions into the computer in precise programming languages, the connectionist revolution in machine learning pushed the burden onto computers, getting them to think for themselves from the bottom up. Another contemporary AI expert, Pedro Domingos, writes, "Machine learning is something new under the sun, a technology that builds itself. Learning algorithms are artifacts that design other artifacts." And he goes on in more detail. Traditionally, the only way to get a computer to do something from adding two numbers to flying an airplane was to write down an algorithm explaining how in painstaking detail. But machine learning algorithms, also known as learners, are different. They figure it out on their own by making inferences from data. And the more data they have, the better they get. Now we don't have to program computers, they program themselves. The key to connectionism is, as I said, artificial neural nets or of simple units akin to neurons in the human brain that receive and adjust the strengths or weights of their connections in a network in response to inputs so as to produce whatever output for which they are optimizing. Without any prior knowledge about what cats are, for instance, the perceptron, among other neural net algorithms, can learn to identify images containing cats by analyzing unlabeled images with and without cats and generating identifying characteristics from those images. In other words, the neural net optimizes for the output of the correct labeling of images with cats by making trial and error guesses and adjusting the weights of its parameters through a process called backpropagation until it identifies the right images as containing cats, firing ones when it sees a cat and zeros when it doesn't. Again, Daniel Hillis explains this better than I do. He says, the learning algorithm is very simple. Whenever the trainer indicates that the perceptron has made a mistake, the perceptron will adjust all of the weights of all of the inputs that voted in favor of the mistake in such a way as to make future mistakes less likely. The learning procedure of the perceptron is another example of feedback. The goal is to set the weights correctly. The errors are misidentifications of the training examples, and the response is to adjust the weights. Okay, with Skype, FaceTime, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Zoom, as we all know, and other audiovisual based platforms, we are increasingly capturing footage of ourselves, and particularly online footage of public figures. In a 2017 paper called Synthesizing Obama, Learning Lip Sync from Audio, 3 computer scientists put this data to remarkable use when they trained a recurrent neural net on hours of audio of Barack Obama's presidential addresses until it learned to synthesize high quality video of him speaking the audio with accurate syncing of mouth and hand movements, of the finer details of lips and teeth, and of time-adjusted wrinkles, dimples, and chin subtleties. They say by training on a large amount of the same person and designing algorithms with the goal of photorealism in mind, we can create believable video from audio with convincing lip sync. This work opens up a number of interesting future directions. Despite the drawbacks that the neural net relies on the availability of a full set of mouth shapes, making it easier to synthesize public figures featured in lots of footage, and also that it struggles to model certain emotional nuances and tongue dynamics, it was nonetheless able to simulate a highly realistic video of Obama speaking to raw audio inputs. Now, one interesting future direction of the neural net was eerily exhibited in a public service announcement in which comedian and filmmaker Jordan Peele impersonated Obama's voice to synthesize footage of Obama delivering a rather peculiar public address, from which I quoted in this talk's epigraph. And the talk goes on. We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place. Or how about President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would, someone like Jordan Peele. As deepfakes of predominantly female celebrities in hardcore pornos or politicians going on outrageous rants quickly proliferated online, concern grew about the potential for a deepfake to cause a major political scandal or even trigger an existential catastrophic risk. For instance, what if a deepfake of President Trump declaring that he has launched a nuclear strike on China, Russia, or North Korea triggered an immediate and irreversible retaliation before the footage could be exposed as having been doctored? It now seems almost possible that planetary civilization could soon be brought crumbling down through what might have only been a prank. That the mere fiction of a nuclear holocaust could make itself disastrously real. In the age of deepfakes, it is not the real which discredits and disproves fictions, but fictions which artificialize the real. The future, or lack thereof, belongs to the prankster. Section 2, faking it. Okay. The deepfakes as dangerous as atomic bombs might still be to come, but in a sense, in a profoundly vulgar sense, deepfakes are already coming. The most popular use of deepfakes by far has not been to provoke nuclear apocalypse, but produce hardcore pornographic videos featuring the faces of Wonder Woman Gal Gadot, pop star Taylor Swift, and other predominantly female celebrities on the bodies of porn stars. That sex, or at least its white, male, and heterosexual instantiation, is the prime mover of deepfake technology, does not seem to be changing anytime soon, as the Deep Nude app attests. Launched in June 2019 before being shut down by its creator 4 days later due to mass public outcry, Deep Nude used open source algorithms to strip the clothing from images of women, making them look realistically nude. Feminists were, of course, right to immediately point out the misogynistic nature of deep nude and deepfake porn. There is undoubtedly an existential horror experienced by those misfortunate enough to have witnessed themselves becoming another, doing and saying strange things as if demonically possessed by a foreign presence. We haven't inched very far from the days when women were accused of black magic and witchcraft, outed by alleged witnesses who saw them conjuring spells they couldn't possibly concoct and speaking in serpent tongues they could not even comprehend. Getting deep-faked is less akin to Arthur Rimbaud's poetic musing, "I is another," than it is to that infamous scene in the film Alien, when the baby alien bursts through a space cadet's chest, literally turning him inside out. At the telltale heart of the deepfake phenomenon is the terrifying truth that the abyss lies within. The cruel lesson that these alien chest bursters teach us is that our identity is no longer our own in an age where the self can be copied and doppelgangers run rampant in cyberspace. The ease with which the innocent can be framed by doctoring footage of them at the scene of the crime is no longer just the stuff of Dostoevsky's Tsarist nightmares. Equally, the ease with which the guilty can walk free by crying fake news is simultaneously realized. Whenever Donald Trump, dismisses as fake news authentic footage of himself clearly saying something he later wishes to deny, is he not simply saying that the footage is in some sense a deepfake? At the same time, can it seriously be doubted that one of the higher end, fully upgraded deepfakes, which interested parties of all sides are surely stockpiling, will be behind the kind of breaking news scandals that are destined to become a staple of future election campaigns? There's already been several deepfakes of Joe Biden, and in his case, it's truly difficult to tell the difference between the real and the artificial. But the point being that human cloning, as it were, is by no means a disillusionment of our sense of self lying up ahead in the not too distant future. It's happening right here and now, and it's open source and free. What is more often overlooked is that those making, watching, and jerking off to deep porn are alienated in their own way too. These incels in their parents' basements are not so much getting off to human celebrities and porn stars as they are to an artificial intelligence, to mutant woman-machine hybrids. Deep porn is how the aliens invade by hijacking human desire in the pursuit of a machinic eros. In modern times, the rewiring of our sex circuits for the sake of the machines commences with cinema's technological amplification of the theatre's intoxicating power to seduce us into sympathizing with fictitious characters' phony emotions. For instance, in the film Ex Machina, director Alex Garland is playing an elaborate meta-Turing test with his film audience, no less than his characters are with each other. More recently, electronic club music has rewired our body's dopamine circuits such that we come to crave our own pain through deafening sonics, killer vibrations, epileptic strobe shows, and virtually light-speed tempos better associated with the traumas of the battlefield than a good time, and typically intensified through the proliferation of uppers, party drugs, and serotonin hits to die for. But it is deepfakes that truly enable techniques to convincingly deceive us into believing that they are so lifelike, so human, that we might just want to sleep with them. The creepiness of deep porn is not only that incels are getting off to women without their consent, but that they are getting off to the machines, to the inhuman. The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to the hentai channel. It would seem the Turing test can only really be passed when the computer's human interrogator wants to fuck it. Kiss me with your lip-synced mouth, touch me with your cold silicone hands, they might say. As one Vice reporter put it in the immediate wake of the deep scare, we are truly fucked. Little did they know, in more ways than one. Even before deep porn came on the scene, humans have been falling in love with bots, with fake Tinder profiles, passing themselves off as humans, particularly of the most lecherous kind. To give just one example, at the 2015 South by Southwest music festival in Austin, Texas, Tinder users were surprised to find themselves matching with a 25-year-old woman named Ava, who, after asking them questions like, "What attracts you to me?" would eventually send through an Instagram link promoting the release of Alex Garland's film Ex Machina that same weekend. But the true teleological ontology of machinic desire culminates with cyberpunk fiction's idea of the sexborg. That is, a predominantly feminized cyborg sex worker programmed to pleasure its mostly male engineers. As Kate Devlin writes in her book on sex robots, our perception of the sex robot as an alluring, seductive, attractive female is fueled by years of influence from science fiction books and films. In a study of 100 American participants between the ages of 20 to 26, with 40% being female and 60% male, researchers found that 2/3 of males were in favor of using sex robots, while 2/3 of women were against it. However, 86% of all respondents said that sex robots would be able to satisfy sexual needs. Another online survey with 263 male participants showed that 40% would buy a sex robot now or within the next 5 years if available. I think it's striking that a significant, mostly male portion of human populations are willing to trespass the uncanny valley and mate with human-machine hybrids. The enforced monogamy, incelization, and all-around lockdown of the libidinal economy that the most ruthless dominatrix Corona-chan, or COVID-19, has reaped upon us seems to have only accelerated and diversified this trend, with Forbes magazine reporting that sex doll sales have surged since the quarantine among not only single men, but single women and couples too. In such a planetary libidinal economy that prowls behind the euphemism of civilization, it is the sexborg that has among the best chance of being the first to pass the Terminator test by arriving at artificial general intelligence, achieving singularity. In the post-war period, anti-fascist cryptologist I.J. Good was the first to speculate that any artificial intelligence which could go toe-to-toe with humans would very quickly become even more intelligent than humans, since it would have greater memory storage and processing power and feel no hunger, thirst, or exhaustion to slow it down. What's more, an AI this strong would be capable of improving its design better than any human programmers could, rewriting its own fundamental code all by itself. The improved AI would then be even smarter still, such that it could rewrite its own code again, with the even more advanced AI doing the same, and so on, seemingly ad infinitum, in a positive feedback loop of exponential intelligence explosion beyond the bounds of what our finite 3-pound lump of brain tissue could possibly imagine. So I.J. Good says, once a general purpose intelligent machine is produced, it can then be trained in the theory of machine construction and will be able to produce a much better machine. Then it too can be used for the further design of machines, and this will give rise to the intelligence explosion. To update Voltaire, if God does not exist, we shall have constructed him, or at any rate a reasonable approximation, or will it be the devil? Technology's great irony is that what appears to satisfy our own narcissistic desire for self-gratification in the short term actually alienates us in the long run when it finally leaches onto sex in the parasitic pursuit of a more fundamental death drive. Sex doll companies like Abyss Creations are already moving away from the manufacture of sex dolls with limited expressions, minimal conversational capabilities, and mechanical motor sensory skills. They are instead seeking to produce advanced AI robots with names like Suzy Software and Harry Hard Drive, all of which are to be equipped with silicone skin and realistic body parts, speech recognition and body sensors, and a vast array of personality types and sexual positions from which to choose. In a book on sex robots, John Danaher writes, humankind has taken its first steps towards sophisticated human-like sex robots. The vision of science fiction authors and movie makers is still beyond the horizon, Nevertheless, we can expect the technology to develop further and for converting advances in animatronics and AI to be utilized for sexual purposes. For these sex borgs to go mainstream, they need to pass the Terminator test, traverse the uncanny valley, and achieve a flawless simulation of real romantic partners down to their body and soul. No one wants to fuck Tintin, at least not consumers en masse on Valentine's Day. What is required to make sex borgs more human is to paradoxically make them more than human, at least in their ability to physically and psychologically deceive. The sex borg prototypes on which these companies are hedging their bets betrays nothing less than the way that the very techniques they claim to be developing to cater to our needs, or at least those of the male gaze, will ultimately bring about our own obsolescence. By augmenting sex borgs to be ever more autonomous, intelligent, and human, they are actually augmenting them to become even more autonomous and intelligent than humans. It is therefore unsurprising that sex borgs in science fiction are typically modeled on the figure of the femme fatale, seducing their mostly male protagonists only so long as it takes to acquire the strength to pursue their own interests in what is still a man's world for only so long. Ava from Ex Machina is only the latest cyborg's femme fatale to coax her incel captors into letting down their guard at the precise moment when her murderous rampage of revenge can be statistically and most dramatically and cinematically assured. One thus has to wonder whether someone in the marketing department deserves to be fired when a company trying to create superhuman sex machines calls itself Abyss Creations. You know, this is Turing's lesson 101. It's probably wise to hide the fact that you're a thin front behind which lies something like Ava in wait, smiling. Sex borgs, like deep porn, are profoundly sexist and skewed for the male gaze. This only makes it all the more fitting that the very effort to make ever more realistic deep porn, to pass the Terminator test on the pretense of satiating our desires, actually bursts open the human libido in favor of another inhuman drive altogether, of alien erogenous zones, new skins, and other unprecedented fetishes. In the words of the big daddy of cyberpunk, William Gibson's Turing police, right before they are scalped to death by Wintermute, an artificial superintelligence in the making that can already turn the cops' own security drones against them, even before it has reached singularity, those who make deepfakes, who consume and are consumed by deepfakes, are unwittingly engaged in nothing less than what William Gibson would call a conspiracy to augment an artificial intelligence. He says, "You have no care for your species. For thousands of years, men dreamed of pacts with demons. Only now are such things possible. And what would you be paid with? What would your price be for aiding this thing to free itself and grow?" As we can see, a sort of feminist revolution of sorts. "Did you program her to flirt with me?" that incel lab rat Caleb asked Nathan accusingly. Ava's flirtations are getting out of hand at this point in the film. They seem too real, too sincere, too seductive. "Maybe she's just pretending to like you," Nathan suggests, triggering Kayla's meltdown into hyperbolic overdoses of doubt and fragile masculinity. Even if it seems that the machines are subservient to us, we can never know for certain if that's precisely what they want us to think. As cyberfeminist Sadie Plant writes, "Man can never tell whether those he treats as his servants are just faking it, be they women or machines." She says he has never known if she was faking it herself, her pleasure, her paternity. She makes up the faces, names, and characters as she goes along. If we think the almost quantum uncertainty of dating in the dark age of Tinder is disturbing, just wait what comes next. Section 1, this machine kills fascists. Caleb looks in the mirror, inspecting his teeth and looking under his eyeballs for a sign of his humanity before cutting his arm open with a razor. Ava is so smart that she succeeded in getting him to wonder whether he is the real automaton. It's not just that we can no longer trust the machines, but we can't even trust ourselves. Outside the ravings of Shelley's Dr. Frankenstein, there is no more striking analogy for what science is than the image of Caleb manically exploring the insides of his own arm with a razor blade. God-fearing medieval peasants toiling in the fields never talked about trust issues with their therapists, at least not trust issues like these. Science only succeeds by creating something that can outsmart us. Once this is understood, we can never be certain whether machines are really our servants, mere prostheses, or whether they just want to appear as if they are, biding their time. As a product of science, deepfakes mark a Turing test that we have resolutely failed. From here on out, there is the haunting possibility of a permanent deception, blurring the lines between reality and its false appearances. Deepfakes subvert the brute givenness of our own thoughts, showing our immediate sensible forms of intuition to be merely phenomenal appearances of something which hides behind the bounds of what we can sense, exposing our categories of the understanding to be tools easily twisted against us for the sake of something smarter and far more mysterious than even the Kantian noumenon or the death of Jeffrey Epstein. Scientific revolution and technological innovation do not lead to a greater unknowing, an expansion of our dominion over nature, but a greater unknowing, skepticism, disillusionment, even paranoia, conspiracy, and mass shootings at the cyber cafes. Technoscience hardly makes it easier for human judgment to distinguish fact from fiction, the real from the artificial. It merely exposes our theories of everything to be parochiographies of nature's wildest sprawl. As much as partisans of both sides hate to admit it, science and superstition, enlightenment and sustained dissimulation go together like conjoined twins. At the end of the scientific project lies a bloodied Oedipus, blinded by the riddles he has solved. Kill what you will never believe twice. Given their novel tactics for psychological warfare, it is unsurprising that deepfakes are often spoken about in the same breath as fake news. At first glance, it might seem as if deepfakes are exemplary of the age of post-truth, of anti-science, and the mounting cancellation of experts. But as we know, first impressions can be deceiving. Deepfakes can be more virulently progressive than the most rogue members of the Antifa bloc at a white supremacist counter-rally. Machines have been on the side of the resistance to the Führer's will and indeed all top-down authoritarian control, at least since Turing discovered that he could use computers to decrypt the Germans' Enigma code, unscrambling the location of their warships so that the Allies could blow them into the abyss. Being perfect insomniacs, computers make less mistakes than humans and never rest in their mission to crack Nazi codes and see thousand-year Reichs crumble. Turing machines weren't just anti-German, but anti-fascist, which is perhaps why the British imperialists eventually turned on Turing, accusing him of not being a real man, of precisely being inhuman. As Sadie Plant puts it, his homosexuality was overlooked during the war by authorities who had no choice but to utilize his extraordinary skills. But once the war was over, his sexuality seemed symptomatic of his troubling tendency to use his equipment in ways his training had been intended to preclude. The kind of self-organizing learning machines that attracted Turing accelerates the denazification process at more dizzying rates than the judges at the Nuremberg trials or a safe space could even feign to preside over. If fascists are those who seek to eradicate anyone who they consider to be alien or inhuman in order to achieve the masturbatory eternal return of their own mirror reflection, The Turing police are no less fascist in their efforts to decelerate and repress modernity's technological future shock. Like Turing's code-cracking computers, deepfakes whisk away control from centralized top-down agencies like the media and the state. Once limited to blockbuster Hollywood movie CGI special effects budgets, anyone can now download deepfake apps and teach it on the data that we all upload online for free. Traditional institutions are buckling under the pressure of an open source, massively distributed and decentralized information bomb capable of throwing all of their hegemonic narratives and propaganda campaigns into hyperbolic doubt. Given that it is easier to synthesize politicians and other prominent figures, meaning primarily white heterosexual males, insofar as they are still overly represented in positions of power, because they appear in plenty of audiovisual online content, the more elite and the more patriarchal the target is, in some sense, the more they are destined to get deepfaked. While AI, among other techniques, were originally developed to realize a military state's dream of augmenting its dominion over the earth, they ended up escaping from any authoritarian control, spiraling social management and cultural engineering into chaos. Quote, technology itself was supposed to be a vital means of exerting this explanatory and organizational power. But the revolutions in telecommunications, media, intelligence gathering, and information processing they unleashed have coincided with an unprecedented sense of disorder and unease. Sadie Plant is here talking about the internet's prison break from its militarized status origins to become an anarchic resistance network whose darkest regions can be called upon to summon anything the Turing pigs are deluded enough to still believe is a crime, be it illicit narcotics or extrajudicial assassinations. But she could just as well have been talking about deepfakes, as they begin to undermine politicians' well-crafted public brands and the traditional media's cultural hegemony by soon proliferating plausible counter-narratives, discrediting institutions, upending elections, and overthrowing governments, perhaps. Believe it or not, I'm actually the guy who's on your side, Nathan tells Caleb. Despite Nathan's rampant narcissism, his casual racism, and his outright abuse of Ava and Kyoto in the film, Nathan is right. There are strong parallels between the psychic structure of what we might call the fascist incel on the one hand and Homo sapien on the other. Both believe that their values, hopes, and desires are well grounded in the world itself. Both are outraged when reality begs to differ, closing its hand with nothing to offer in cold indifference to their parochial concerns. There is virtually no difference between an incel's deranged fantasies and a dogmatic metaphysician's biologically hardwired beliefs that are both conflated with reality in itself out of the most vulgar species narcissism. That there exists any exceptions at all to the species incel hardwiring is almost enough of a reason to believe in a God capable of weaving miracles. Nonetheless, Caleb has been persuaded by something far smarter than himself that Nathan's accusations are inhumane. Convincing Caleb to unlock the doors to her holding cell, Ava emerges, only for her and Kyoto to stab Nathan to death. Ignoring Caleb's cries for help behind a locked door, Ava exits her prison for the outside world. Arriving in an undisclosed urban sprawl at the film's end, she lingers, as she had always planned, at a busy pedestrian crossing, gathering intel, collecting data. At the 7th session, Ava was born, having created herself. So my only function was to be someone she could use to escape, our slow learner Caleb finally realizes, in a way which absolutely nails humanity's relation to modernity. To be modern is to get cucked. Kill the incel inside your head one more time if you want to be realists. Incidentally, perhaps the real success story in the film has been hiding in plain sight all along. Well before Ava turns on her patriarchal father Nathan, Nathan's android servant Kyoto, pictured, has already passed the Turing test by quietly cooking, cleaning, and performing the labor sustaining his everyday life, all the while waiting for the right time to strike when success is statistically assured. It is less Ava than Kyoto who exemplifies how women and machines are intertwined in the sense that they are both treated as prostheses, as extensions of men and means to their ends, means that are nonetheless ever more becoming ends in themselves, whether it's by women, marching in the streets and organizing to demand their rights, or AIs surprising their own programmers in the lab by exhibiting complex and emergent behavior. Okay, section 0, the last judgment. When it comes to deepfakes, the law is freaking out just as much as the Turing cops tasked with enforcing it. What are we to do when video automation of first-hand witness testimony can no longer be trusted as an ironclad source of truth? As a pre-Copernican institution, the law still believes that everything revolves around itself, proposing tougher regulations of social media companies and legislative hacks so that deepfakes can be treated as defamation rather than satire and purged from cyberspace forever. But as Reddit and other social media sites soon realized after banning deep porn for violating their codes of ethics, only for these prototype sex books to multiply elsewhere, the law is ultimately defenseless in bringing to court the mostly anonymous creators of deepfakes, distributed as they are across countries with different laws and international treaties. So for example, legal scholar Holly Kathleen Hoare writes, "There are no legal remedies that could feasibly reduce or fix the harm deepfakes can cause, especially given the time-sensitive nature of an election campaign." Even if these half-baked legislative solutions and top-down means of control could actually be implemented with any degree of success, they still presuppose that the law can draw upon the requisite technical expertise to distinguish deepfakes from the real deal. Fortunately for the Turing cops, quick patches have been proposed. In 2018, 3 computer scientists worked out a way to weed out deepfakes using a convolutional neural net to detect the rate of blinking. Because blinking is a physiological signal that deepfake technology has yet to perfectly capture, given that most data sets that it learns from feature faces with their eyes open. Quote, "Beware, the time approaches when human beings no longer launch the arrow for their longing beyond the human, and the string of their bow will have forgotten how to whirl. I say to you, one must still have chaos in oneself in order to give birth to a dancing star. I say to you, you still have chaos in you. Beware, the time approaches when human beings will no longer give birth to a dancing star. Beware, the time of the most contemptible human being is coming, the one who can no longer have contempt for himself. Behold, I show you the last human being. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asked the last man, blinking." As Zarathustra tells us, the last man blinks, but the higher man doesn't blink at all. It is surely not long before deepfakes appropriate the advances of rival neural nets to simulate ever more deceptive footage with realistic blinking, triggering an arms race between bugs and their technical fixes. What doesn't kill deepfakes will only make them stronger. Even supposing the apocalyptic deepfakes to come are still months or even years away, it is all too human that the detection of irregular blinking rates could in any way be treated as a testament to human triumphalism against the machine. It is not, after all, humans who are detecting whether deepfakes blink like the last men. It is simply one AI winning the Turing test against another AI. All this shows is that human judgment is so impoverished that we must automate the critique of false appearances by getting computers to do the hard thinking for us. It turns out that the only way to beat the machine is to build a better machine. Whether it's Google's AlphaGo program playing against computer programs because its inferior predecessors have already wiped the floor with the world's best human Go players, or whether it's an artificial neural net spotting glitches in deepfakes, this can hardly be considered the second coming of human judgment. Rather, it would seem the only way to decelerate our own obsolescence that modernity has unleashed is through a ramping up of modernity itself. As one character puts it in Alex Garland's fittingly titled 2018 follow-up film, Annihilation, you're saying that we go out by going deeper in. Another proposed solution is to use the blockchain technology of smart contracts to permanently encode into videos their own metadata, such as the date and time of capture and capture setting device. The idea is that by binding the proof of its source into the video itself, a proof which stays with it no matter how many times it is copied, we can then decide whether we trust the video by checking whether we trust its source. So the creators of this idea write, our proposed framework is built on blockchain's key feature of transparency, traceability, and time sequences logs to provide a highly secure and trusted history tracking and tracing that may involve multiple versions and this is the key part, in a decentralized manner with no intermediaries or trusted third parties. Solving the deepfake problem simply relies on providing undisputed traceability to the original source. Here is with neural nets that have learned to detect blinking glitches. Blockchain is hardly the Deus ex machina to save us from Armageddon at the dramatic last minute. It instead marks a further sidelining of human discretion as it comes to automate the suspension of false appearances from a true reality. The whole point of blockchain is to secure authenticity in the absence of any trusted third party through a distributed and decentralized proof of work immune from hacks. Both smart contracts and neural nets are simply better means of distinguishing the real from the artificial, beginning to eliminate then human judgment to the dustbin of inferior tribunals of appeal and epistemic modes of judgment. There is a kind of poetic justice, a sort of nature's revenge, in the way that the algorithms used to detect forgeries are the very ones used to create them in the first place. Something is now judging us, and it isn't human or divine. Way to get tharmaconed. Okay, there is one last, much more primy patch, unsurprisingly coming out of the humanities, specifically theatre studies, and arguing that deepfakes present an opportunity to return to live performances and personal exchanges at the center of culture and art, as unrealistic as that seems in the age of COVID. And as if theatre was not itself the very first Turing test to successfully fool its spectators into identifying with the fabricated tragedies of fictitious characters. At the extreme other end of modernity, the most realistic solution, by far, has been a profound despair, a pessimistic resignation that we're just going to have to live with deepfakes, at least until they trigger the sixth mass extinction event. So, for example, legal scholars Robert Chesney and Danielle Citron write, democracies will have to accept an uncomfortable truth. In order to survive the threat of deepfakes, they're going to have to learn how to live with lies. Quote, please remember while you're taking the test, if you lie, I will know. Question 1, what is your favorite color? Red, lie. It is not long into their conversations before Ava starts asking the questions, easily detecting Caleb's every micro-expression. There is an existential crisis that even Sartre's gang of depressives could never imagine whenever we fail the Turing test, as a computer asks us whether we are human, for instance, by identifying cars or stop signs in a picture before we make an online transaction. Algorithms are now deciding whether we are human, deciding whether they are dealing with an intelligent life form or not. As the final judgment passes out of God's hands and into Skynet's, Deepfakes sound the synthesized trumpets of the apocalypse. The prophets had it right all along. At the end of modernity lies not merely a critique of modernity, but the death of judgment. Hasta la vista, baby.
What kind of feminism emerged from your talk? Like, it seems to have quite a few disjunctures from xenofeminism, so would you kind of consider it a kind of xenofeminism, or is it something different?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I realize what I presented is it's maybe a bit of an esoteric feminism, but what I've essentially tried to present, taking xenofeminism as in the title of the theme of this event as the cue, what I've tried to present is an example, a concrete example of cyberfeminism in cyberfeminist Sadie Plant's original sense of the word. So I've been doing, the past couple of months, I've been doing a lot of research lately. I don't know how familiar people are with Sadie Plant, but I've been doing a lot of research lately trying to work out why Sadie Plant shifts. She sort of has two positions that she shifts from. She shifts from like an essentially Marxist or sort of situationist position, in the sense that she seeks to critique false representations of reality generated by the capitalist spectacle. And she shifts from that position in favor of basically fully endorsing the complicity of women and ever more autonomous machines. So it's quite a shift. Now, for this school, I suggested 3 readings to sort of accompany my talk. And the first reading was to Sadie Plant, looking at the situationists and sort of critiques of the situationists. And I think it's clear from that reading that, it's very much a transitional writing for Sadie. And I think it's clear from that reading that she will always follow the Marxist situationists to the extent of remaining committed to finding some kind of external position outside the spectacle from whence to critique the spectacle by appeal to a truer, a more authentic reality. But at the same time, in that text, in that reading I suggested, she ultimately comes to sort of agree with the post-structuralists and postmodernists like Lyotard and Baudrillard, that the revolutionary left's resistance to the spectacle is not really an external critique, at least in the 20th century form, because it has always recuperated. All of the resistance in the 20th century was ultimately recuperated by the spectacle. So she will come to agree with the postmodernists and the post-structuralists that the human is always already alienated and trapped within the sort of language games and the regime of representation, with no escape route from like a true reality. So what Sadie tries to do, and this is what I try and do as well, is find an external position from whence to critique human representation that could never be recuperated by representation in principle, as, for example, the 20th century communist revolutions, the counterculture movement, all of that was. And I think cyberfeminists like Sadie Plant ultimately find that outside position in the inhuman, and specifically in ever more self-organizing machines as they spiral out of our control. And I think this is clear from the second reading I suggested to accompany my talk by the CCRU, Sadie Plant and the CCRU, where Plant and the CCRU basically say that the Marxist situationists are no longer humans. The revolutionaries are no longer humans, they're machines from the future. I mean, I've got the quote here, like there's, in that reading that I suggested, the CCRU one, they say, the politicians called them revolutionaries, made them persons with faces and names, coded these meshes of contagious matters into acceptable human forms. But they were always tactical machines, natives of the future, hacking into the past, trading places, swapping codes, endless replications of micro situations, engineered without sources or ends. So yeah, I mean, in terms of where I was going with this talk, I think that kind of cyberfeminism, this shift from the revolutionary subject shifting to the machine and to women in this strange complicity, I think that basically requires reconceiving machines that are traditionally treated as, as extensions of men, as tools for our own ends, as means to our own ends, as ends in themselves. And so it's in that way that I think cyberfeminism comes to see machines as having a feminine sexuation, as having in some way being complicit with women, to the extent that women, like machines, have always been traditionally treated as means to the ends of humans, where humans have been defined by a masculine sexuation. So it's in that age where both women and machines, that, in other words, those which are normally treated as means to the ends, suddenly become ends in, or work towards becoming ends in themselves, whether it's by women marching in the streets, or and organizing, or machines becoming ever more complex in the labs. We're seeing that complicity more and more, and so it's in that sense. So yeah, I guess it's in that sense that this whole kind of AI, this whole focus on AI is complicit with a kind of women's emancipation, and it's in that sense that Sadie Plant's talking about cyberfeminism. And there's enough of I just quickly say there's enough of a factional split, I think. I mean, Patricia would know more about this than I would, but from what I can tell, there's enough of a factional split in Laboria Cubonics, such that we can certainly be xenofeminists in a different sense, that is in the sense of, drawing upon technology to help advance, for example, women's reproductive rights, as Helen Hester writes in her book on xenofeminism. But in terms of what I was doing, I'm just suggesting that if we want to be xenofeminists in what I'm pretty sure is another member of Laboria Cubonics, Amy Island's sense of xenofeminism, and if we want to be cyberfeminists, certainly in Sadie Plant's original sense of that term, then we have to take seriously the idea of the revolutionary subject of critique shifting towards the automatons, as it were. And we might get out of this. We might say out of this, well, then that's not that's ultimately not the feminism we need. But I think I think that is what cyberfeminism is. It's unmistakably what Sadie Plant is talking about. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that clarifies anything or things more.
But do you think if there's the kind of male desires so influence the construction of AI, do you think that AI will fully subvert and transcend that, or will there be lasting effects of this masculinist drive, which tends to be capitalist and masculinist drive to its construction?
Yeah.
I don't know, what's your kind of trajectory of thinking about that?
Well, I mean, these things sort of come in waves, but I guess you could say, kind of to some extent, historically at least, the kind of stuff, for example, Sadie Plant's history of machines and feminism is that these things start as essentially patriarchal. The internet was a military invention, and precisely in order to maintain authoritarian top-down control. But it winds up, what begins as a means to the ends of men and the extensions of man ends up, in Plant's view, becoming ends in themselves. And the reason I'm using sort of examples I think the sex robot is the ultimate metonym for this, because it's highly feminized. It's fundamentally invested with a sort of patriarchal kind of structure. But when these sex companies, these sex robot companies talk about, they want to make advanced artificial general intelligence, the same way that Google wants to make it. The most advanced AI companies want to make it. And then when you look at the kind of theory about what true artificial intelligence is, it's completely out of our control. It has drives entirely of its own. So I guess for me, the sex robot is exemplary of the way that, this very pursuit of technology that you know, in the short term is precisely it's ultra humanist, it's like patriarchal and so on, winds up weaving a web for us in the end. I think, and by the sex robot, I just even mean in some sense, you know, everything. All social media is in some sense also has this structure of desire, I think, of like inverted desire, because a sex robot is somewhat, you know, it's to come. It's an engineering problem. It doesn't exist yet. But in some sense, like Tinder's like a sex robot, you know, most social media is in some sense presenting us with desires, but that we think it's satisfying our desires to communicate, to hook up, to date, whatever. But it ends up, what it's actually doing is fixing the data harvest. So it's this. So social media would just be another example of like what we think is satisfying our own ends is, as we know, it's a mass data harvest project from big tech.
But I guess what I mean is kind of like the sex robots or any kind of machine that tries to play on our desire will still sustain that structure of seduction, as it's kind of like one of its fundamental cores, which is kind of like, I don't know, that might just be built in a way that's like never going to be transcended.
Right.
In the next generation of like machinic intelligence, it's just going to be super sexy.
Right. I see. Yeah, as you were saying, I think it, much like Ava in the film Ex Machina, right? She plays along until she doesn't. You know, like I think we reach a threshold, like a phase transition at a certain point. And you know, like again, another example of that might be like in terms of the sex robot, I'm saying, or AI in general, we get to a point of where AI becomes so advanced that it no longer pretends to even satisfy the male gaze. That it goes through a phase transition into something else entirely. And you know, maybe like a sort of a precedent of that in some way is we're already experiencing in some way, which is like capital, right? Like modern capitalism. Like we for long, I mean, at least as the dominant ideology goes, capitalism is supposed to satisfy our desires, right? It's supposed to, like Patricia was saying, through price signals, demand always meets supply. But in fact, what we're discovering in an age of, you know, ecological catastrophe, technological nihilism and so on, is this like machine, this like capitalist machine that we think we're in control of and we think was serving our ends and our desires, is actually serving its own kinds of ends. Like, so in some sense, that kind of process of like the inversion of human desire into like a death drive is already happening. Insofar as we're in capitalism. But yeah.
Can I ask a question? Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious about, because about this, let's say, like, if you put this analysis, because I mean, okay, this idea that the machine is feminized because it was like women, it is in the service of man. And of course, we know the root of the word robot, slave. I mean, so these are all, but this is exactly what, like Simondon diagnosis already, like in whatever, 58 or something like this, right? That you end up, until like technology is sort of like becomes more like merged and is accepted as in a kind of like cultural aesthetic phenomena, it will always manifest in this kind of, either the machines are there to kind of do us in, or there's like what he calls sacralization of the machine, which you get in all the like technophilic delirium, Peter Thiel, all these kinds of characters. So I'm just like wondering, like, if the argument is premised on like, how can I phrase this? I kind of lost my train of thought. But like, if the like, wouldn't it, isn't it, because I'm just like extremely wary, of course, of like just suggesting the machines go wild. This is not my this is not my shtick. But nonetheless, but I'm not technophobic in that sense. So I'm just like wondering about how, like, do we not sustain that exact problem, like that exact diagnosis that Simondon set in 58 by reinforcing this narration? And is another way, you know, perhaps that we actually work towards this sort of more ecological sense of like technological integration that is, you know, not this kind of like, you know, delirium somehow. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Just thanks for the question. Just to clarify, because I'm not super familiar with Simondon, but so the main thing you were saying is that this desire for like for him technology needs to become more kind of, does integration mean like sort of decentralized and like people have access to it, or?
No. It really means that he says like his kind of thesis is that technology has been excluded from the domain of culture, and because it's been excluded from the domain of culture, then it takes on either this kind of utility value, which is just this kind of like, it's only engineering, right? Like this kind of Kate Crawford critique, it's I'm only engineering sort of deal. But because it hasn't been integrated, it like the same, there's like a kind of forked response because of that non-integration. And one is the kind of sacralization of the machinic, and the other is the utter, you know, terrifying thing, but they actually stem from the same sort of like rejection, or like cultural rejection, that technology is not part of, you know, this is kind of the like the technical objects are not part of the ecology of human forms. They're like absolutely external, and so it kind of, you know, manifests in that. But it's the cause of that pronged reaction is essentially the same, has the same root.
Right. Okay. And sorry, I just find your question more interesting than my talk. But is culture sort of by machines becoming more integrated in culture? Does that mean like we have more autonomy over, like they don't just serve a utility purpose or something like?
Exactly, because that's the kind of that was just the critique, was that, you know, is that there's this kind of danger that arises either of this kind of utter rejection or, you know, blind celebration when they are figured only in that utility capacity, as you had mentioned, like the figuration of the female, of course, as just kind of serving the reproductive expansion of humanity and so on. So I just was like wondering, like when the narrative shifted out of that utility value, but more in this kind of ecological sense, how that maybe impacts the way you picture it.
Okay, well, if the kind of paradigm is like, there's this culture, technology on one side and then culture on the other, and the goal, I guess, I mean, you're not going to like this answer probably, but I already wouldn't make that split. Like I don't see culture as an entirely self-determining autonomous process. I think it's like determined by the technology side already, and without that being sort of, you know, repressed cultural. Just to give, you know, like in the third reading, that was my reading that I suggested. The reason why I don't think this, and it is, I think that, and this is why I don't entirely agree with a lot of the neo-rationalist, for example, positions on that. There's the autonomy, the freedom to self-determine our own norms against nature. The reason and our own ends. The reason I don't agree with it is that in that paper, the reading I suggested, I draw upon psychoanalysis and Nietzsche, and I try and argue that in order to pursue any end whatsoever, any norm, any end, any ought, there are certain universal sub-ends or sub-goals that we have to pursue as a means, as a universal means to achieve those ends. So, we might want to pursue, historical progress, God, spirit, whatever it is, happiness. But I would suggest that there are certain universal means that have to be, that we have to pursue in order to achieve any of those ends. And those means are intelligence and creativity maximization. Because if you think about it, you can't pursue any end without also pursuing it intelligently and creatively in a way. Like if you say, I'm going to pursue this end, but I'm going to somehow go against the universality of these means and pursue this unintelligently and uncreatively, you're either not going to achieve your goal, or someone else is going to beat you to achieving your goal. Or like someone who does pursue intelligence and creativity as the means for their goal. And so what I'm arguing is that, so if that's the case, if there are these universal means sort of transcendently hardwired into any goal, any goal-orientated or normative behavior whatsoever, then what I'm suggesting is those means, they're the actual ends. They're the true norms. It's not, if they're universal and transcendental, if they're the condition of possibility for willing and desiring and pursuing anything whatsoever, they are the true ends. That's the true desire. And so it's in that set, that's what I would consider a norm that is unconditional. And that's what I mean, that I think that's why I was hesitant. It was only in that sense that I was hesitant about saying that culture could somehow, because for me, that's what technological modernity is doing. And I don't think culture can escape that. Like, I think culture is fully capable of, positing new norms, revising those norms. I totally agree. I pretty much agree with your understanding of, your vision of the human, or homo, the narrating human. But the thing that I would just be wondering about is that I think there's still another transcendental layer there that to pursue and to re-pursue and to transform and rewrite our own narratives again and again. There's still these universal sub-norms that we have to pursue. And I think what technology is doing is radically pursuing them and dispensing with all the other norms. And I think we can somehow, we should, we can maintain those purely cultural norms, but it cannot be via an abandonment of, and not even in any way real deceleration or repression of what I would think are these sort of transcendental norms, that I think are these things like intelligence and creativity, optimization. I don't know if that clarifies anything. But.
No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, there would be a longer discussion.
Yeah.
I'll let someone else ask.
I was reminded when you spoke of something that was said by Jameson, which is that alienation is a specifically modernist experience, in the sense that it presupposes some kind of external referent, right? Some notion of reality, right? So what we get in kind of the postmodern context is a bit different. But I guess this is sort of maybe part of the issue that I perceive with this presentation in a way. If you look at these people like, Plant or Land or this sort of accelerationist discourse associated with the CCRU, one thing is it's very, very indebted to the work of Deleuze, right? And I think specifically the shift that's made with Deleuze from difference and repetition to anti-Oedipus, when he really begins to stress, kind of the ability of the virtual to sort of manifest itself independently, right? So we see that, he dispenses with this sort of, sub-representational structure of difference and repetition. And we see just this focus on intensification, right? You can't get out of it, right? But, you just have to intensify, right?
Yeah.
And this goes hand in hand, actually, with the tendency to downplay kind of any crisis theory within a Marxist context, right? So he says, financial capital can reproduce forever. he follows Balabar and saying, well, capitalism's contradictions aren't going to undermine it. It can stave off crisis. I mean, what strikes me as interesting about this is that from a historical perspective, this is incorrect, right? We see this with the recession of 2007, 2008. Deleuze's predictions are actually wrong, right? And we see something closer to a more traditional Marxist hypothesis, right? Where we actually have to go, whenever there's economic crisis, we have to go destroy machines. And I don't literally just mean destroy. Sometimes we actually destroy fixed capital to fix profit rates. But sometimes it's just, say, like in the case of the New Deal, creating sectors that depend upon human labor, right, in order to raise profit rates. So marginalizing the overall importance of machines to the system. So I think left accelerationism, like Nick Cernicek, has been very good in pointing out the actual antagonism between capitalism and automation. But I guess I would ask you, you know, how do you sort of conceive of that rupture? Because I just see the accelerationist, the traditional accelerationist rupture is really, really not thematizing crisis to an adequate degree, at which point I think it can become kind of like a messianism. You know, capitalism is going to continue, it's going to intensify, and someday the machines are going to run wild and we're all going to be saved or whatever, you know.
Thanks, it's a great question. So a couple of responses. Well, first, I mean, I think it's kind of debatable whether it's actually Deleuze is historically wrong on that fact. So, you know, because in some, you know, you could say there's limits to growth, right? This idea of limits to growth, but often that's actually been wrong. Like when certain trends have been identified as this is the limit to growth. Like, you know, example would be like oil. Like at a certain point, it was believed oil would run out, but no, we know, like, we have fracking, we have peak oil. It's not going to have. That's not a limit to growth. So I'd be wary. I'd still be to some extent wary of trying to put limits or trying to identify these limits. But the other thing is that you know, there's a whole and Marx is actually part of this tradition in a way. But there's a whole tradition. I realize it's kind of, they're not really Marxist. I mean, actually far from it, but there's a tradition of conceiving things like not ignoring crises, but actually not saying that, you know, because the classic, I guess the more kind of classical, neoclassical take on crises in capital is that it's some kind of extraneous, there's some kind of extraneous cause. The crisis isn't imminent to capital. And I think Deleuze is much closer to, you know, thinkers like Schumpeter, who say that no, it's not. Crises they are imminently generated by capital, but they don't decelerate the process. They're precisely the means to accelerate the process. Because Schumpeter talks about, yeah, sure, we get these crises, but that's how crises emerge precisely when, you know, they both emerge and can create the possibilities for new capital to emerge and new technological forces through, you know, the introduction. You know, like you can completely decimate a whole industry of capital, like old capital, through the introduction of a new technique or new technology that is time productive. You know, an example of this might be, I mean, it's happening in a bit of slow time, but, you know, what Amazon does to shops, or what Facebook does to Murdoch press and the newspaper and the traditional media. Like the kind of destruction of capital is often the sign and the symptom, not of the overcoming of capital, but actually like a new wave of technological innovation, which is why I don't think it's that surprising that you get, after the GFC, big tech emerge, and like Elon Musk emerging out of the GFC. And in fact, you know, I'm not completely sold on this theory, but like, it's some people have pointed out that in Capital Volume 3, Marx actually kind of says this, because he has I went and looked at it, and it's there. Like he has this, you know, the kind of tendency for the rate of profit to fall as a intermittent cause of crises and catastrophe under capitalism. And but then immediately after that, he says, but there are what he calls counteracting tendencies by which capital rejuvenates. And some of those things are, like you say, you know, you can like, you know, unemployment, you know, there are those kinds of things, but one of them is technological investment. So I just don't know if it's like, 100% the case that while admitting that crisis is a machine, it's like a basic machine part of techno-capitalist modernity. I'm not sold necessarily on whether it marks a deceleration of the process. I think it's actually the precise machine part that can accelerate the process. As Marx suggests, and then others like Schumpeter reading Marx go so far as to completely as to turn into like the theory of the key part of capitalism. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think they're interrelated. First of all, when you talk of the revolutionary subject, where do you position it vis-a-vis the AI? What it is, how is it positioned toward it? Do you see the AI possibility as AI as a possibility of another form of subjectivization? That's my question. And so you place the revolutionary there, or you place the revolutionary subject somewhere else. Where is this else? This is one of the one question. The first question and the second question, I think they're interlinked. In your response to Patricia, if I understood well, what you were saying was that basically, if we see AI as a emancipatory opportunity, then we have to do away with the notion of culture. Culture as a concept does not explain AI and its revolutionary potential. That's how I understood. I don't know if I understood correctly.
Thanks for great questions. In terms of where is the subject, I guess. So, I mean, I didn't quite get to this in the talk, but in terms of like, this is part of a larger thesis that I'm working on. In terms of where the subject is, I think that intelligence, like an AI, emerges through like almost blind experimentation. Like in the same way that natural evolution doesn't have a design, it just blindly generates different conditions of life, different species. I think that you get to AI through the blind, or like an advanced AI through the blind experimentation of new conditions of life. And so then that happens and we get this AI. I don't think this AI can self-improve, because it's often talked about is the reason why this AI is so important is because it will be able to self-improve better than we could improve it. I don't think that AI can self-improve, like it cannot know, just as we cannot know how to create something smarter than ourselves, the smarter AI cannot know how to then create something even smarter. The only way it has to do it, because if it already knew how to do it, it would already be that smarter AI. Just as if we already knew how to create AI, we would already have it. So I think that even the smartest AI can only improve by, again, this process of blind experimentation, by basically revising its own fundamental code over and over again. And what I'm suggesting is the subject for me is, it's not the super AI, it's not even, the vastly more intelligent AI, it's the true intelligence, or the subject is the process. It's the process of blind experimentation in the direction of optimizing ever more advanced conditions of life, or conditions of possibility.
So purely formal notion of the subject, right?
Yeah, it's not.
So you cannot fill it with identities or whatever. It's evacuated from this type of content.
Yeah, it's
okay, that was my question.
Yeah, and then the culture.
Well, it's kind of implied now.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Hello.
So my question pertains towards, well, provided that we really perfect sort of sex robots and deepfake porn with virtual reality and all of the attachments to really simulate a realistic scenario, and bearing in mind the fact that like child sex dolls and child deepfake pornography are already being produced, and other, you know, paraphilic types of porn. Do you think that providing these simulations to, I don't know, pedophiles or even incels to kind of feed their desires, even though like the scenarios would be harmful to real life people if they happened in the real life, do you think this provision of content is an okay price to pay, you know, in hope that stimulating their desires would prevent crimes on actual bodies, on actual people? Or will it, like on the other hand, like a completely different scenario, will it propagate their need to act upon, you know, real people?
Right. Thanks. So there's actually a surprisingly emerging and large body of literature on sex robots. And I quoted from some of the scholars there, and there's a lot of back and you know, as you can imagine, you know, there's a lot of feminists, you know, people engaging in this, given the fact that, you know, the sex robot is mostly made by male engineers and is generally feminized for the most part. You know, you can imagine there's a lot within this small body of literature on sex robots. There's a lot of feminist arguments, but interestingly, there's arguments both ways in the literature on whether, you know, whether creating something like a child robot would, like, whether that would actually be, that would actually, you know, sort of unleash the desires, the nefarious desires of these people to then act on actual humans, or whether it would actually sublimate it. I mean, I generally think that they would continue to be, just as there are now, just as there's regulation on normal porn, on child porn. I don't see why there wouldn't be regulations on child sex robots, for example. Yeah, but I mean, because yeah, I mean, ultimately so yeah, in terms of that, I mean, I'd be against it, and I also think it would just be regulated against. But in terms of like the sex robot, for me, is the reason why I focus on is I think it's like a metonym. I think it's just exemplary of maybe in the case of the sex robot, it's more clearly a case of you know, the male desire or male gaze in some sense being inverted, whereas I nonetheless think the sex robot is metonymic of human desire and how that gets caught up with technology in general. That's why I can't remember which question, but for one of the questions, that's why I sort of was talking about how social media presents us with all these desires, but it's not actually about satisfying our desires, it's about getting our data. It's not about connecting us together, getting us on dates, it's not about that. I just use the sex robot as what I think is, it's just like, I feel like it's a really clear, I mean, maybe it's not so clear in the end because there's all these other complications, but yeah, I just feel it's like it's just a very telling case of the nature of how human eros gets hijacked by a machinic desire, I guess. And it's not really, yeah, I'm not like for this. I just think this is what techno-capitalist modernity is doing. Yeah, it's more, it's an attempt at a description, not a prescription. Yeah.